Hey everybody, this is a follow-up to my last topical video that I put out last week about what are the benefits of using liturgical worship. What do we mean when we talk about the liturgy or the work of the people, the public service that we offer when Christians join together to praise God. And I talked about using written, structured, traditional liturgies or worship services that have been handed down with a call and response kind of pattern to them, where there's a leader in a congregation and we're reciting or reading, or in some cases singing, these traditional prayers that have been handed down to us. In some cases the Psalms, the Lord's Prayer, other prayers from the Bible, things like the Creed, the Doxology, the Gloria, all of that we collectively call, and the Communion Prayer, the Great Thanksgiving, we collectively call that the liturgy of the church. It's the offering that the people make. And in my last video, I talked about some benefits and some reasons why we use the liturgy, and some of the biblical reasons for that, and also some of the potential drawbacks that you could be sort of reciting things or reading things without really engaging your heart and mind in what you're doing. It's just become kind of a rote thing that you do, and you're not personally engaging with it. And that's, of course, always a danger. Today, as promised in my last video, I want to talk specifically about the Book of Common Prayer and how it has kind of grown up, what it is, and how it has influenced Wesleyan or Methodist worship traditions. And so, as I mentioned last time, basically, the early church developed very early on patterns of liturgy and forms of prayer that were used in all over the place, and they gathered a lot of that from the traditions of the synagogue and the temple. And because you got to think about it, Christian worship didn't just spontaneously arise out of nowhere. The New Covenant builds upon the Old Covenant, and one of the reasons why I think liturgical prayer is important and worshiping in this way with the liturgy is because this is the way Jesus worshiped when he went to church or synagogue. When he went to the temple, he would be participating in the liturgies, the rites, and the traditional prayers, and the singing and chanting and reciting of the Psalms. All of the liturgical life of Israel, that was how Jesus prayed. And, as we see in the Garden of Gethsemane and other places in the Gospel, he also prayed extemporaneously, or just freely, pouring out his heart to his Father in a very free and open way. And among Christians, it seems to me that there's often this either-or attitude, like you're either doing liturgical prayer or you're doing extemporaneous or free prayer. And as I'm going to talk about a little later on with John Wesley in the prayer book, I think part of the genius of the Methodist tradition, as with so many other things, is it tries to bring these things that people tend to break apart and hold them together. And actually, we're going to do both. We're going to have liturgical prayer and free prayer so that we have the benefits of both. And we don't have to pick one or the other to the exclusion of the other. So where does our liturgy come from? If we're in the Wesleyan tradition, the Methodist tradition, or more broadly, in the Anglican tradition, remember John and Charles Wesley, who started the Methodist revival movement, were both Anglican priests, and their father was an Anglican priest, and so they grew up probably every single day, actually, praying and worshiping with the forms of the Book of Common Prayer. So the early church developed these liturgies and these worship traditions and services, drawing on the Bible, drawing on the traditions of Israel, creating new traditions under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, we hope and expect and pray. And the liturgy spread across, of course, Christendom, across wherever they had churches across the world. And the liturgy, as I mentioned last time, it developed and developed and developed, and by the late Middle Ages had, in some cases, become kind of convoluted and overly cumbersome to actually pray the liturgy. You got to turn into this book for this prayer, and then for this part of the service, you got to pick a whole new book out, and you're doing all this back and forth, and people, I imagine, based on the descriptions we have from the Reformation era, people are kind of sitting around waiting for a lot of the service for the priest or the deacon or whoever's leading to find the right prayer, and people are kind of looking around, scratching their heads, hopefully praying, right? So one of the aims of the Reformation was to reform the liturgy. And this is true both for the Protestant reformers, but also for the Roman Catholic Reformation at the Council of Trent. Everybody saw the need to to streamline, to simplify, and to reform the liturgy. And in England, of course, one of the main ways they wanted to reform the liturgy was to bring it to the people in English, in the language of the people. And, of course, the liturgy started out in Latin at a time when most of the people knew Latin, but as the language evolved and changed and new peoples moved in and everything, the people in England spoke English, but the church spoke Latin, and so there was a disconnect. And looking in part to what Paul says when he talks about speaking and praying in tongues in the churches in 1 Corinthians, he says, I wish that you would speak in a language people could understand so that people will be edified. The Protestant reformers said, yeah, we need the liturgy to be in the language of the people so they can understand it. And 400 years later at the Vatican II Council, the Roman Catholic Church got on board with that idea too. Just a little slower getting there perhaps, but coming to the same place though. So, led by a fellow named Thomas Cranmer, the English Church reformed the liturgy and translated it into English and produced the very first Book of Common Prayer of 1549. This is an edition I picked up at Barnes & Noble one day, the first English prayer book. It's kind of designed to be accessible to modern people, but it's the 1549 prayer book, and that is Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, who was the principal compiler and translator, and he also composed some of the material himself. Archbishop Cramer, when Queen Mary tried to take the English Church back to Roman Catholicism, he was put under a lot of pressure to recant, and he kind of waffled a little bit, but ultimately said, no, I'm sticking by my beliefs as a Reformed Catholic and not a Roman Catholic, and so he was burned at the stake. So this prayer book is produced by somebody who was martyred for his faith. So the 1549 prayer book came out, and at the time, there were these tensions within the Church of England between kind of a more conservative or Catholic or Lutheran theology or a more kind of radical or Reformed or Calvinist or Puritan theology. And this tension exists. It's one of the things that causes the English Civil War, actually. So the prayer book goes through some revisions over the years with new monarchs coming in and kind of leaving their stamp on it. But ultimately, so you've got the 1549 prayer book, you've got the 1552 prayer book, came just a few years later, and it's a little bit more Reformed, more Calvinist. And then Queen Elizabeth comes in after Mary, and they revise the prayer book a little bit more, and you have what's called the Elizabethan settlement, and she reigned for such a long time, a lot of things just sort of settled into place. In the next century, in the 1600s, you have the English Civil War, you have some more of this religious controversy attached to that, and there's political aspects to all of it. But at the end of the day, at the end of the English Civil War, and after Cromwell's gone and the monarchy's been reestablished, they produce a new prayer book. This is the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, and this is for the prayer book tradition a lot like the King James Bible is for the English Bible translation tradition. This is like the gold standard. This is the one that has had the most impact. And even to this very day, the 1662 prayer book is the official worship book of the Church of England. And it is the standard that new prayer book revisions tend to look back to when they're creating it. And this is the prayer book that John and Charles Wesley and their family would have worshipped and prayed with, probably, as I said, on a daily basis. So this prayer book, you think about forming the spirituality and the prayer life and the theology of the Wesley brothers, who then lead the Methodist revival within the Church of England. This prayer book had a tremendous formative influence on them. And Wesley loved the Book of Common Prayer, as he talks about. So we fast forward to the beginnings of Methodism as a separate denomination. That happened not in England, but actually it first happened in the United States because of this little thing called the American Revolution. You might remember that the King of England is the leader, basically, the governor of the English Church. And so once we, in the colonies, were separated from the King of England, we were, ipso facto, also separated from the Church of England. And that's when Methodism became its own denomination with the Methodists in America. John Wesley sent over leaders to help organize the new denomination. He sent over Thomas Coke to be the first bishop, and he sent over a theological statement, basically an abridgment of the 39 Articles of the Church of England, and he also sent over a revision of the prayer book. John Wesley, as I said, loved the Common Prayer Book, and so he wanted the early Methodists to use a revised version of it. So John Wesley gave us the Sunday service of the Methodists in North America, and other occasional services, I think is the subtitle. And like the Book of Common Prayer, this is a book of prayers and worship services. And like the 1662 prayer book, it has services for baptism, services for communion, for morning and evening prayer, services for weddings and funerals, and other traditional liturgies that are part of the worship life. Also including a long prayer called the Litany, or the Great Litany, sometimes it's called, which is a very long back and forth prayer, and it has very much a kind of penitential character. Some people use it in Lent, and it's a prayer for God's protection and deliverance, basically, for almost every conceivable situation. And this is what John Wesley said. He sent a letter and some instructions along with his revision of the Common Prayer Book. And he says, "I believe there is no liturgy in the world, either in ancient or modern language, which breathes more of a solid, scriptural, rational piety than the common prayer of the Church of England. And though the main of it was compiled considerably more than 200 years ago, so he's writing in the late 1700s, so he's looking back to the mid-1500s, yet is the language of it not only pure, but also strong and elegant to the highest degree." And he also says, in a letter he sent, talking about his revision of the prayer book, he says, "I have prepared a liturgy little differing from that of the Church of England, I think the best constituted national church in the world, which I advise all the traveling preachers to use on the Lord's Day in all their congregations, reading the litany only on Wednesdays and Fridays, and praying extempore on all other days." And so that's an interesting insight into how Wesley thought the liturgy should be used. In the Church of England, my understanding was in those days, the common practice was to have on Sunday mornings morning prayer, then using the litany, the Great Litany, this big long prayer, as a bridge, and then following it with the communion service. And so you have morning prayer, which is an independent service, then the litany, and then the communion service. And then on weekdays, you would pray the morning prayer service and then the evening prayer service. So Wesley is suggesting using just morning prayer and the communion service on the Lord's Day, and then using the litany only on Wednesdays and Fridays, which were for the Methodists fast days. All the early Methodists were expected to fast at first on Wednesdays and Fridays, and then later they kind of softened it to just Fridays. So every Friday of the year was a fast day, and earlier Wednesday and Friday, and they would also pray the litany, this long penitential prayer, as part of that spiritual discipline. Maybe that's something worth bringing back among the Methodists. So one of the things Wesley says is that the Lord's Day service, the way it's done in England, is kind of long. So he did shorten some of the services. He cut things out that he thought were redundant. He didn't really add anything to the Common Prayer Book. He just shortened, basically, a little bit, the services that were there in the 1662 prayer book. And so if you pick up a United Methodist hymnal today, it contains much of the same material in terms of which services it contains. It's been very much influenced by the Book of Common Prayer. There are in here services for morning and evening prayer. There is a selection from the Book of Psalms to be used in worship. There are services for baptism and Holy Communion and the wedding service and also the funeral service, along with statements of faith and, of course, hymns. It's the hymnal. And some kind of miscellaneous prayers to be used on different occasions. Prayers for the sick, prayers for a closer walk with Jesus, prayers for the nation, prayers for the church. You can find all those in here too. So all of that material, minus the hymns, is what you find if you open up a Common Prayer book. And in the Common Prayer Book, you also have the services of ordination for bishops, for presbyters. We call them elders typically. They're often called priests. Those are presbyters. And then deacons. So bishops, presbyters, and deacons, ordination services are also to be found in the Book of Common Prayer. So Wesley created this revised version of the Book of Common Prayer, which has become kind of the touchstone for Methodist liturgy and still exerts some influence over our worship books and our hymn books in the United Methodist Church and in other Wesleyan bodies. Now, the 1662 prayer book, like the King James Bible, is in this beautiful but archaic English that many people today find difficult to follow or to really understand. And so there have been new revisions, particularly in the 20th century and the 21st century, of the Book of Common Prayer. So there's the 1979 Book of Common Prayer of the Episcopal Church, which is the first Common Prayer book I really became familiar with and worshiped with. And I like the 79 prayer book. I think it's probably the most, just in terms of the English being easy to read, it's probably the most accessible. The newest edition is the one I've been praying with lately for morning prayer, is the 2019, well, you can't see the Roman numerals there, the 2019 Book of Common Prayer of the Anglican Church in North America. So this one's just from a couple of years ago. And it is, in many ways, like the 1979 prayer book of the Episcopal Church, but they wanted to get a little closer back to the 1662 prayer book. So in some ways, it reflects that 1662 prayer book more than the 79 prayer book, but but there are also many similarities between the 79 prayer book and the new 2019 prayer book, and they're both in contemporary English. So these are beautiful ways to pray. I love the prayer book. I think it's just one of the most beautiful jewels of spirituality, not only in Protestant Christianity, but in all of Christianity. And the liturgies are solid. Much of the language is taken directly from or paraphrased from the Bible. A great deal of the services, especially morning and evening prayer, is simply praying the Psalms or praying other songs and canticles and prayers found in the Bible as your own. And as I said, that's how Jesus prayed when he went to synagogue, and it's a very rich and spiritually formative way to pray. And as I've said, I've done videos on why use liturgy, why use pre-written prayers. Those are two videos I've done you might want to check out, so I don't ramble on too long about repeating things I've already said. So the prayer book tradition certainly has been extremely formative for the English-speaking church. And not just Anglicans and Methodists, but Presbyterians, certainly, but even like Lutherans, when a lot of those German immigrants started translating their services into English, they would borrow from the Common Prayer Book, even Roman Catholics. I think the way most English speakers pray the Lord's Prayer today comes from the Book of Common Prayer, regardless of their denominational background. The way that we're accustomed to saying it, the kind of the traditional language of the Lord's Prayer, is from the Common Prayer Book. And so it's had a tremendous impact on the English language. There are expressions that people use sometimes that come from the prayer book. And the wedding service, of course, through movies and TV from the prayer book is certainly kind of out there in our cultural vocabulary. But it's a great way to pray. It's a great way to worship. The 2019 Book of Common Prayer and the 1979, probably all basically major editions of the Common Prayer Book, are available online for free. And there are places where you can find Wesley's revision of the prayer book online as well. So if you would like to start praying with the prayer book, or maybe go find the litany, or it's sometimes called the Great Litany, and start praying it whenever you fast, or maybe make that a Lenten discipline. Those are things that you can start to do already. And it's a great way to learn with the Wesley brothers how they prayed, and to pray with them in a sense, but not only with them, but also, with Shakespeare, with C.S. Lewis, with so many people from across the English-speaking world who have prayed these same prayers and have lived with this same worship tradition. You're joining with people from across the ecumenical church, saints, and joining in with them in our common prayer life, because that's kind of the point of a common prayer, that we're praying together in common. So I hope you will check that out, and if you have any questions about the prayer book, I'd love to talk more about it. And until we connect again, may the Lord bless you and keep you always. Amen.